Just like movies, just like television shows, video games, and books, Dungeons & Dragons is often a storytelling medium. We explain a narrative through D&D, and yes, it is true that most DMs are not master storytellers, especially on our first go-around. But it is important that you communicate your world, your story, your characters to your players. What does that mean? Well, very often, it means exposition. In a previous video, I mentioned that exposition is not a bad thing, especially in Dungeons & Dragons. DMs shouldn't be afraid of exposition. However, I didn't really talk about how to do exposition, quote-unquote, right, because it definitely can be done wrong. If you've seen the film The Last Airbender, not the television show, the film made by M. Night Shyamalan, it is probably one of the worst examples of exposition in history. I won't put a clip in here because I might get slapped in the face with a copyright strike, but just know that exposition in that movie is terrible. It is constant, it is annoying, and most importantly, it is largely unnecessary for the narrative. However, exposition can often be done really, really well and can engage the audience. Take Blade Runner 2049, which has tons of exposition throughout the film, or Lord of the Rings, which has a huge exposition dump at the beginning of the film. Both these movies are noticeably better than M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender, and for multiple reasons other than just the exposition. But what makes these films and their exposition different from the exposition found in The Last Airbender? And most importantly, how do you apply these lessons to your D&D games in order to avoid the dreaded DM single-person exposition session? Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so tip number 1. Only do exposition for information that your players need to know. This is something that the Last Airbender movie really struggles with. In that film, characters go on and on about information that is irrelevant to what the audience needs to know. Take multiple lines about the Great Library, which doesn't show up at all in the film and isn't really relevant to the plot. These lines are completely superfluous and just bog down the narrative with extra information. Now, you're not talking to an audience, you're talking to players, but it's the exact same principle. You don't want to bog down your players with superfluous information. Remember, they're here to play a game. Yes, they're also here for the story, but if the story is overwhelming and or boring, well, then they're definitely not going to be having fun. Extra details can be interesting. There are things you can do to round out a world. For example, I have a location in my world called Libertalia. It's where a lot of the dark eldritch relics come from. It's sort of a high-class black market of evil magics. It's a fun idea, and it's where a lot of the NPCs get their magic from in my campaign. It is not completely important for my players to know about this place, Libertalia. It is not relevant for the most part. I mean, it is interesting to know where certain NPCs got their magical artifacts, but it's not entirely necessary. But it helps to round out the world, and explaining what Libertalia is doesn't take too much time. However, extra details about, for example, the Wood Elves of the South, Wood Elves and their culture have not made any impact on my story thus far, that would be superfluous. They're not relevant to the current story of the campaign, whereas Libertalia's black market goods have made their way to the hands of many of the more suspicious characters throughout the campaign. So there is a point to showing where these relics came from. It's not incredibly important, but since the players show interest in those things, I can take the time to give a little bit of exposition about where these relics came from. Additionally, Dungeons & Dragons is an interactive medium. When you're reading a book and you want to know more information about X thing, and for example the Harry Potter universe, I can't just go up to J.K. Rowling and go, hey, can you tell me more about this bank or this shop? That's not how it works. Sorry, I haven't read Harry Potter in a while. But in Dungeons & Dragons, You can do that. The DM is right there. You can have your character roll insight or roll history to find out more about something. As the DM, allow the players to choose to learn more information about a place or a thing. I was surprised when, during one-on-one sessions, one of my players asked me if they can visit Libertalia and learn about it. In fact, a couple of my players asked to visit Libertalia and learn about it. That gave me an opportunity to give additional exposition about this place and the people who run it, the entities that live there, etc. They chose that exposition. They wanted to learn more about it. Even if the details are irrelevant, the players having the desire to learn more about this information kind of cancels that out. This whole point boils down to this. Allow your players to determine what information they want to learn more about, and try to keep superfluous information out of your campaign. Don't bog down your narrative, and keep your exposition concise. Another big thing with exposition, especially when you're just improving it, is to make sure that you focus on what you're talking about. When you're a DM, where you've homebrewed a world, or you're very passionate about Faerun or Strahd's Barovia, any sort of exposition, whether it's your own world or one made by a module, you can get carried away. I know I do. When I'm really passionate about what I'm talking about, I can go on and on and on. The last point was about making it concise. This one is about making it focused. Make sure that you focus on what you're talking about. Make sure that what you're talking about is relevant, and make sure that your players are interested. You need to read the room. If you see the players are starting to get disinterested and wanting to move on, wrap up the exposition dump. Now, your exposition dumps should not be too long. When you're talking about one city, you don't need to go on and on about all the details about it. Usually, it's important to just talk about what the role of the city is, generally who's in it, and that's usually it. I don't need to go into all of the political nonsense I've written for every single city, the imports and exports, their financial status. Just focus on what's relevant for your campaign. I kind of already talked about this in the last point, but it is worth noting that getting carried away is something that's very easy to do when you're doing exposition. In fact, when you're playing Dungeons & Dragons in general, and you're really passionate about the homebrew world that you created, getting carried away can be easy. But make sure that it doesn't happen to you. You need to keep this stuff interesting. Now, another way to keep it interesting and to focus it on something is to talk about this exposition from the perspective of a character. For example, when I'm giving exposition about a city through the perspective of a guard, I'm speaking through the guard's perspective, and therefore, since I'm speaking through the perspective of one person, the exposition becomes more focused. When I'm speaking from the exposition point of a thief, the thief will talk about the government likely in a very unfavorable tone, more analytical, because the thief looks at the government as something to be overcome. When I'm speaking from the perspective of a guard, his exposition point would be more about the strength of the government and the criminals in the city, again, as a threat to overcome, looking at it as a distant threat, not as a close ally. Their exposition points are different, their perspectives are different, but if I deliver exposition about the city from either of their perspectives, I have a more focused narrative to give to my players. Make sure to choose your point of exposition wisely. If you want your players to see the city as corrupt, speak from the perspective of a citizen, or a disgruntled guard, or a thief, someone who has a bone to pick. If you want the city to appear righteous, speak from the perspective of a noble, a guard, someone who supports the city's government. Therefore, giving your exposition a focus and allowing you to stay coherent and stay where you're supposed to be and not get carried away. Alright, so the next tip, how to engage your players in your exposition. I often hear the DMs complain about their players not being engaged, and I usually find that what they mean by engaged is engaged in my lore. Now, I don't want to just say, make your lore good, because that's not a good piece of advice, quite frankly. But there is a very practical way to engaging your players into finding details in your story. And that is make it important to gameplay. For example, Quite recently, I gave my players a little bit of a quest, a mysterious quest for 5 legendary weapons, each for a specific player character. This definitely got their attention. Legendary weapons? Yeah, that sounds cool, especially since loot is a big part of my campaign. Alright, Crispy, but how does that connect to exposition? Well, these weapons are the reward for paying attention to story beats. The way the players find out where to get these weapons is by paying attention to the story. Take, for example, the axe I'm going to give to my fighter warlock hybrid. This axe is hidden in a place called Carcosa, a place that only has been mentioned 3 or 4 times in the campaign and was only really relevant for 1 session. It was part of an exposition dump about the Eldritch Void, which I delivered through some characters that were driven insane by these eldritch entities. I thought the dump was interesting, but it wasn't really truly relevant. Carcosa was a mysterious place that is a reference to some really old fiction that had to do with eldritch horror. Now, why is this important? Well, the axe is found in Carcosa. Now the players know that them paying attention to those details about this ancient eldritch place earlier in the campaign, now they know that that is rewarded. Me tying in that exposition from earlier, those story beats from earlier that they paid attention to, that allows them to notice, hey, we are now being rewarded for paying attention and listening to those details. These details matter. So now in the future, when I give details about other things, the players will write them down. They'll be invested. They'll be listening because they could matter in the future. Another tip I'm going to take from Matthew Colville is to chase your players up a tree. Put them in a situation and give them a problem that can only be solved with lore details, a puzzle or a mystery. Those are 2 very good examples. I'll link his whole video in the description and in the cards. It's a really good video about how to engage your players in your lore. Alright, that is where we are going to wrap it up for today. If you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more episodes of this series as well as my other content, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.